everyone. This is John Daly. I'm here with another episode of the Daly Express. Some of you may know me primarily through my political and cultural commentary. Others know me through my fiction writing. I've written 5 published novels. I'm currently working on number 6. My Sean Coleman thriller series has won multiple awards, and one of the really fun things about being an author has been meeting other authors, a lot of times through my publisher. One such fellow who I've come to know and like quite a bit is Robert Silbering. He's a retired longtime New York City prosecutor who was actually quite instrumental in the war on drugs. He was involved with some very important cases, and he also served as a consultant on film and television projects, usually ones that dealt with courtroom themes, legal themes. He has a new book out called Law and Disorder: How a Kid from the Bronx Became America's Top Drug Prosecutor. I recently spoke to Robert about his book and about some legal topics, including the drug situation in our country, cameras in the courtrooms, and what really goes on in the district attorney's office in these big cities. Robert's a very smart guy. He's a lot of fun, and I hope you enjoy this interview with him. I'm here today with Robert Silbering, author of the new book, Law and Disorder: How a Kid from the Bronx Became America's Top Drug Prosecutor. How's it going today, Robert?
Very good, John. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for asking. So, Robert, as one can probably figure out from the title of your book and also from your accent, you are from New York and you have a pretty impressive legal background. Can you tell people about your upbringing and your education and what first drew you into practicing law?
Well, as the title of the book suggests, I grew up in the Bronx and I came from a lower middle class family, and that stressed education. My brother was a brilliant student, and I was just the opposite. I was a schoolyard kid. I'd go to the schoolyard and I'd play baseball, softball, stickball, football, whatever you want. And school was secondary to me. I never really cared much for school. And in fact, I would cut classes in high school. My mother probably spent more time in high school with the teachers and the deans than I did, because I cut geometry. There was nothing I hated more in life than geometry. And I finally ended up going to school, to college. I went to Fairleigh Dickinson in New Jersey. And I guess either I matured or a light bulb went off, and all of a sudden school became important and I did well, and I ended up graduating with a scholarship. And while I was there, I always had an interest in watching police shows. I remember watching The Untouchables and Law and Order and all these shows. And I had some professors. I took some pre-law courses and it interested me, and I decided to go to law school. But the interesting thing, on my way to law school, was the Vietnam War. And rather than being drafted, I went into teaching. And I taught for about 3 years and actually went to law school at night while I was teaching. And while I was in law school, somebody told me about that the Manhattan DA's office, which was the most prestigious DA's office in the country, was looking to hire legal interns. And I said, this really sounds interesting to me. And I went for an interview and they hired me. And then I became a paralegal, and I did that for a year while I finished law school. And I said, this is great. And I interviewed, and I got hired as an assistant DA. And it ended up I was there for the next almost quarter of a century, meeting very fascinating people and dealing with very fascinating cases.
Well, yeah, I can only imagine working in the DA's office for over 20 years as you did. I'm sure you have a lot of stories to tell. And in your book, you give readers an intimate look at what goes on in a DA's office and how important decisions are made. There's clearly a lot of public interest right now in true crime and in the legal proceedings surrounding criminal cases. Shows like Dateline and these true crime podcasts are all very popular. What's one thing about your book that you think will surprise a lot of people who are interested in this genre and who may think they already know an awful lot about criminal prosecutions?
I think when they read it, John, they'll realize they don't know as much as they think they know. And the reason for that is that people watch a lot of police shows and they think that, everything is solved when an arrest is made. Well, that's just the first stage in the process. And then it goes on, and that case is handled by prosecutors, the DA's office. And unlike Law and Order, where a case is solved in 52 minutes, uh, many of these cases can drag on for months before they're resolved. And I think the reader gets really a view that they never got from TV, from any books, as to what really happens in a DA's office. What are the bureaus that are there? Who handles these cases? What decisions are made? Why are the decisions made? It's just things that if you're interested in law and in policing, you've never seen it before. So I think you're getting a very unique and interesting glimpse. I can give you another quick story. If you watch Law and Order, half the time you see that there's the assistant DA sits in a room with the defense attorney and the defendant, and they work out a plea at the end of the show half the time. And the guy cooperates. I can tell you that I never sat, a quarter of a century across a room from a defendant and his lawyer and agreed on what a plea was. It doesn't happen. This is real life, not TV.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I think a lot of people would be surprised to learn the differences between the real world of, that you lived in for so long. So in your book, you focus a lot on drugs and drug related crimes. People my age, of course, remember the war on drugs, from the Reagan era. But the big topics we hear about these days include fentanyl, the opioid crisis, and drug legalization. You get into all these areas in your book. Do you see what's going on now in this country as a whole new ballgame compared to the drug problems of the 1980s? And what worries you the most about the current drug situation in America?
I think one of the things is that people are dying every day in this country, usually over 100 people a day from opioid abuse, and nothing is really being done about it. And the last 20 pages of the book, I talk directly about the issues of opioid addiction, of fentanyl, of violent crime, of juvenile crime, and legalization of drugs, which I'm against, and I state my reasons why I'm against it. But I don't think we're taking what's going on seriously enough. And as I say in the book, I think we're headed back to the bad old days of the 70s and the 80s when crime was rampant. We had basically in this country a 20 to 25-year period where the crime rate was drastically reduced to historical levels. Now we see what's going on. Some of it is drug fueled crime, but a lot of it being done by teenagers again. And the book deals with all these things, and we take for granted. My position is we need a national commitment to deal with the opioid abuse and the fentanyl deaths. And it's just something we don't have. I mean, in the presidential election of 2020, the subject of opioids was never brought up. And now that we're facing a fentanyl scourge, we're finally hearing things about that being done. But I discuss all this in the book, and I give the reader my view on it and what should be done to deal with it.
Oh, it'll be an interesting read for sure. That is such a big issue right now. You hear it, talked a lot about it on the news, but yeah, you're just not until recently have you seen sort of the politics begin to catch up with it a little bit. So yeah, it'll be interesting to gather your insight on that. So what would you say? And I ask this of a lot of authors. It's always something I'm quite interested in. What did you find most rewarding about writing Law and Disorder, and what do you hope readers take away from reading your book?
Well, I got interested in this book because people told me for 20 years already, you should write a book. You have a lot to say. You have handled so many interesting cases. You experienced so many interesting cases, and you met so many interesting people, which I talk about in the book, such as Judge Judy, who I dealt with 30, 40 years ago before she was the present Judge Judy. And it was really a cathartic experience because during the pandemic, I said, now I have some free time on my hands. if I'm going to write the book, now it's going to be it. And my idea is to really let people know what really happens in the criminal justice system and get it from someone who's experienced, who knows about it. And that's really one of the reasons I wrote the book, and to give people some insight, because most people get their views from what happens in a courtroom from television or a movie. And if you read the book, you'll find out that, crimes are not solved in a half hour or 50 minutes, and what goes into making a case and how decisions are made about sentencing and so forth.
Interesting. I'll throw you a little curveball, just a
Yeah,
topic that sort of just popped into my
curveballs are
head.
good. Yeah.
Good. So, an issue I hear about from time to time now, it's sort of a controversial. People have different views on it. How do you feel about cameras in the courtroom? That we saw O.J. Simpson was on camera. A lot of people say that's a really bad thing these days, just how the culture is. What's your view on that?
Well, I don't have strong views on it, but um, I never was a big fan of it, because you don't know how the jurors are going to react to it. You don't know how witnesses are going to react. Um, if it could be done, and also it would be very tough in some cases to do it. Especially, you could never do it in a case involving undercover officers, because you would reveal their identity. So, especially in drug cases where you have informants and you have people risking their lives to testify, they don't want to be seen. So that's one big drawback. The
No,
positive side,
definitely.
which is a big drawback, the positive side is people would actually get a realistic view of what happens in a courtroom, and that things move pretty slowly. There's no one big revealing moment like Perry Mason where you find out who the real killer was. Those things just don't happen. Uh, Although I do talk in the book, I mention a case that I handled where involving an alibi, where the defendant says he didn't commit a crime because he had an alibi. He was doing something that night. In fact, he said he was watching a television show that night. And the defense attorney, unfortunately, didn't really prepare. And this was the days before you could just go online and find things out. And I happened to, in my preparation, I got a copy of TV Guide and found out that the show he said he was watching was preempted that night by, uh, in the movie, In the Heat of the Night. And the funny thing is, and I talk about it in the book, the show he said he was watching that night was called SWAT. Today, there's a remake of SWAT. And I showed him the TV Guide and I asked him a question. I said, after you look at this, did you watch SWAT that night? And he responds, he puts his head down and he says, I guess I didn't. And you could just see the jury. And when the testimony was over, the judge turned to me and he says, I guess you really swatted him. And he ended up being convicted. But, it's just real stories of what happens into a courtroom, and about some of these judges, some who are excellent, some who are okay, and some who shouldn't be on the bench. I mean, uh, if I can just take another minute, there's another story there. There was this judge who was a real Damon Runyon character, and it's about 5 minutes to one, which is usually lunchtime, and a case gets called, and he's looking at the write-up of the case, and he says, let me get this straight. He says the victim of the crime, his name is Rivera. He was robbed of his bicycle by two brothers whose names were Rivera. It was witnessed by his mother, Mrs. Rivera, and the arrest was made by Officer Rivera. And he throws the case up in the file, and file up in the air, and he says, and I'm going to the Riviera. And he adjourns everything and breaks for lunch. I mean, it's hard to imagine these things happening, but this is real life. And that's what the book is about. It's really what happens in the criminal justice system. And I think what's really interesting in the book is when I describe when I was the special prosecutor for narcotics for the city and what went on with the crack epidemic and the toll that took. on the city and the people and all the people who overdosed and the arrests that were made and how the system just couldn't handle the volume. So all that is it's dealt with, it's factual, it's real life, and this was part of my life. So the reader will get a real view of, again, what happens in this criminal justice system.
What would you say? I asked you what the most rewarding part was of writing this book. What would you say was the hardest part about writing this book?
Well, I write about things that occurred 30, 40 years ago in many of the chapters. And I'm very lucky because I have a very good memory. And what I did was I actually spoke to some of the judges and the agents who worked on the cases just so that I could be accurate. And that was very difficult, is to try to make sure that I was as accurate as I could describing things that took place 30, 40 years ago. And in fact, some of these people have passed away since that time. But I think I captured it. But that was a difficult thing to do, and to relive some of the things that I went through during that time with the pressures of all these thousands of cases that just came into the system. By the time I left, every indictment which, charges somebody with a felony is signed or stamped with my name. When I left, I had probably more people indicted in drug cases than anyone in American history. So I did experience quite a bit. And there was actually a lot of humor in the book dealing with some of the people and cases that I encountered. And I really encountered, John, quite a bit of very interesting people.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah, Judge Judy, Rudy Giuliani. The man who captured Adolf Eichmann was another one. A lot of politicians. They were all talked about in the book, and I think the reader will find the book very interesting.
I think so too. It sounds like a very fascinating read. Well, Robert, I want to thank you for joining me, and thank you for your
Thank you,
time.
John.
Can you tell people, absolutely, can you tell people how to learn more about you and your book?
Well, they can learn a lot about me by Googling me. I think that's the best way to do it. And if they ever saw the movie Presumed Innocent, I was one of the technical advisors on that movie. That was a great movie with Harrison Ford.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
there's a lot about that in the book, by the way, uh, dealing with Harrison Ford and the actors that were in that. And I also did some work on a very popular TV show, NYPD Blue, when that was
One of my
right.
favorites. One of my very favorites.
Right. And I talk about that, and how I was introduced to the creator of the show and how they had me look at some scripts and so forth. And I've also actually I was on dozens of TV shows, including 60 Minutes, Nightline, and shows like that. And most of this is all discussed in the book. And as I said, I think the readers will find it interesting, different, because they're getting it from a perspective of a prosecutor as opposed to a police officer. And one of the other things that I think is interesting is talking about the police, especially what's going on today when we see, so much about, police and misconduct and so forth. And that's also mentioned in the book. So I think
Well,
it'll
great.
be
Sounds like
a fun and interesting experience and an easy read for the reader.
yeah, it's I think people are going to get a lot out of it. Well, Robert, good luck with your book. Good luck with your if you're writing anything in the future. But
Thank
yeah,
you.
this will be a very interesting thing.
Okay. Thank you, John. It was a pleasure.
Thank you,
Take
Robert.
care.
You have a great day.
Got it.